This is the Week in Sustainability from Sustain.Life. It's where our team of sustainability experts and practitioners share commentary to keep you up to date on developing stories and news.
Hi, welcome back to the Week in Sustainability. I'm Hannah Osofsky, a member of the sustainability team at Sustain.Life. I have Joel back on the podcast. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and let our audience know what you do for us?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Hannah. So I'm a customer success manager here in Australia for Sustain.Life. So I get to spend most, if not all of my day talking to our customers, making sure they get as much value as they can from our tools and services.
Amazing. Last time we had you on, we were talking, we was pre-COP28, and
Mhm.
Chris Bowen was headed to COP with some really ambitious decarbonization ideas. And Australia has passed some very important legislation, including upcoming, or at least we're hoping in 2024, we will see mandated climate disclosure.
Yeah.
And so really exciting things are happening. And we just kind of wanted to have you on and have a conversation about what that means and what it also feels like directly on the ground for the clients. What are they going through?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, COP was a really interesting journey, I suppose, this year. Hey, so yeah, Australia went to the global stock take with some good news, and we're roughly on track to hit our emissions reductions targets. But some of the language that came out of COP was kind of interesting, right? So the final document, the final agreement, sort of talked a lot about the transition away from fossil fuels and called out coal in its use in energy systems, and that obviously has massive implications for Australia. Australia was one of the countries that signed on or pledged to triple our renewable capacity. And so, yeah, we've got a bit of work to do, I think. But I think, yeah, all things are trending in the right direction, particularly, as you say, from that legislative and kind of disclosure perspective as well. So, yeah, pretty exciting times.
And Australia was also sort of in comparison between Australia and the United States. I think when we look at the loss and damage fund, which is probably something that we both feel is one of the biggest wins of COP28.
Yeah.
Chris Bowen was really supportive of the fact that countries like Australia and like the United States need to be pretty forthcoming with funds to that
Yeah.
and that account. And I was really glad to see that at least somebody was saying something like that.
Yeah. I think we've seen a real shift in kind of the tone particularly around climate more broadly, but in that loss and damage domain in Australia, which is really, really good, right? Like, um, yeah, I think I don't want to say the climate wars are over, but they're looking, we're still looking really positive. So yeah, it's good news.
And I imagine that of course, the conversation of climate, I feel like, at least over here, when we think about Australia, we think about the Great Barrier Reefs.
Mhm.
And then most recently, Australia, flooding in South Australia made news over here as well. Uh,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering if that is entering the conversation. Are people feeling it kind of attempt?
Yeah. Yeah. I've spoken a lot in the last couple of weeks just about how immediate the weird weather makes this
Mm.
whole climate crisis feel. And so, yeah, when you're having sort of once in 100 year events every couple of weeks, there's a case or a time a couple of weeks ago where there was like bushfires on one side of a mountain range and flooding on the other. And it's like you can't get away from it, right? It's like it's right there in your face. And so that's it's an awful experience for people on the ground, but the kind of the silver lining is that it makes this kind of climate crisis and this conversation undeniable. So, take the positives, the wins where you can get them, and yeah, just really feeling for everyone who's affected by those floods and fires as well.
I'm from Houston, Texas, and we are very familiar with flooding, and my heart breaks every time I see something like that. And but and the same way, thinking specifically about Houston, Texas, and being an oil town, and Australia being, having a coal economy, those kinds of events push the climate conversation right to the front of everyone's minds. When things like this happen, the way to solve it becomes really topical. And Australia is making some really ambitious goals on how they're going to grow both transmission capacity and generation capacity in future.
Yeah.
Is that something that you're seeing? Are companies aware of that? And are they aware of the fact that they're able to take advantage of it?
They are, yes. The whole energy transition thing is like, it's really front of mind for the customers that I'm working with. It's a key part of, well, they're asking lots of questions, about it. It's kind of like, what does this mean? And what does this mean for us, and what are the opportunities for us when we're setting things like a science-based emissions reductions target. Had this great conversation a couple of weeks ago, just before the new year, with a client who was asking about the grid decarbonisation journey that Australia is on, and how that sort of factors into their own science-based emissions reductions targets that they're setting. And so, the answer is, of course, it factors in. We need to consider the opportunity that this decarbonisation of our grid really presents. And so, we're seeing this really great investment at the federal government level in things like the capacity investment scheme, which is the Australian federal government's way of kind of underpinning or underwriting new renewables projects, both from a generation, a storage, and actually from a transmission perspective as well. So, this change in tone is not just happening in the disclosure domain, but it's really across the board, particularly energy transition as well. So, yeah, it's all good news.
I'm so glad you bring up this idea that companies are asking whether what is happening in the policy landscape is going to directly impact their climate planning. I mean, this is true for us. When we look at our emission sources, one of our biggest emission sources is just the energy required for all of our data processing. And that's not something that we can control directly. It's just something that we have to look to Microsoft and AWS and look at the fact that their plans are to transition to renewable energy. And then just know that that will eventually trickle down to us. And the network effect of all of it is really powerful, and to understand that things happening at the federal level will impact your own ability to decarbonize, and that you need to be involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I really love is the conversations around this stuff seem to be really positive and opportunity focused right now. And I think that's a really good thing. There's a great report that came out a couple of days ago here in Australia that was about, it's called Green Talk. I'm going to find the name of it before I tell you what it was. But it's called, the Sustainability Agenda for 2024. So it's 7 sustainability leaders that we're all talking about what's keeping them up at night and what they're excited about, what opportunities are. And this energy transition is really being seen as an opportunity for decarbonisation and for value, rather than an issue or an expense or a thing that is insurmountable for businesses here in Australia. So that's really positive. The other thing that comes up a lot in our conversations at the moment is this kind of mandatory disclosure that's on the horizon. And I'm sure anyone listening to the podcast will be familiar with the IFRS standard S1 and S2, and hopefully everyone's already thinking about what that means for their organisation already. But that's something that comes up a lot in our conversations here. Are you sort of seeing the same thing with our North American customers as well, Hannah?
Absolutely. Everyone is gearing up for regulations, ISSB being certainly a priority, but maybe lower in comparison to regulations in California and looming SEC, promise. And then also taking it out of the United States and heading over to Europe, everyone's gearing up for CSRD. And what I like about what you were talking about in terms of looking at everything that's happening in the energy grid and feeling positive about it, feeling sort of opportunistic about it, is when we look at these IFRS standards, you're going to need to identify what your risks are. Then you're also going to need to quantify what your opportunities are. It's good that companies are already identifying that, and they can really quickly turn that around and include it in their reporting.
Yeah, you're so right. I think we're seeing kind of this rapid mobilization around, like what are the governance processes that a business is going to need? People are thinking about that stuff now, and I think that's really, really prudent. And how do you kind of underpin all of your data collection and disclosures with high quality data, so that when you get to the assurance stage of all of these new legislations across the globe, you can do that and you can be prepared for that with confidence. But I think there is still a bit of a question mark around, like, how will we do assurance, and how will we make sure that we've got, in a cost-effective and a timely sort of fashion, the data that we need to supply to our assurers, ready. And I'm not trying to pitch really hard for Sustain.Life, but that's one of the things that our customers are excited about here is, that stuff's sort of taken care of in the box. So that's good news as well.
And especially since really large companies have been doing a lot of this for a while. And when we think about really difficult, some of these issues that smaller companies run into is just the data management of it all. And when they look to their logistics company is likely already implicated by a lot of these regulations. They're going to have the information that they need ready and on hand. So we're so close to getting to a point where it actually gets a lot easier
Yeah.
We just have to get over that hump first.
Yeah, agree. Totally agree. So yeah, it's good news. And I think the kind of mandatory disclosure piece is bringing into focus like what's important and which activities are important now, which ones we can sort of hold off on until later. And yeah, I think we're really sort of heartened, I suppose, by the state in Australia and the fact that most people are, if not ready, are really getting ready for that mandatory disclosure piece. And so it's been really cool to be a part of that for, for our customers as well.
Absolutely. And if we want to get into the sort of itty bitty details of stuff, what are the obstacles right now?
Yeah. And so, yeah, I think governance is a really key thing and a really key question mark, I suppose, for a lot of organizations. If they're already in the voluntary space, they likely have good governance wrapped around those voluntary disclosures already. But there's a big difference between the governance that's required for voluntary disclosure and the governance that's required for mandatory disclosure. And so, kind of the big change that I'm seeing is boards entering the conversation, whereas previously they've been above the conversation. And so, when you're thinking about those governance processes, it's not just the executive and the management team who are responsible for making sure the disclosures are right. The board is actually now legally accountable as well. So when you're putting together those governance structures, you've got to be thinking all of the organization, including the board, which really changes the level of rigor, the level of attention, the level of focus that's required, all in really positive ways, but it's a different environment. So wouldn't say that's necessarily like a roadblock or a hurdle, but it is something that organizations are really starting to think broadly about and getting some good structure wrapped around them as well. The other things are really just like, systems and processes. So do we have we like to use this term chain of custody across our data from the moment it's generated by, say, a utility provider to the moment it ends up in a disclosure. What's the chain of custody and do we have good visibility and line of sight across that? Sometimes what happens is you get the data on an invoice and then it ends up in a disclosure and no one really knows what happens in between. But that obviously has to change when it comes to this mandatory disclosure piece as well. So going beyond governance, getting into actual, bases of preparation and really clear demonstration of how that stuff is derived is becoming more important as well. And that's not no work. That is quite a bit of effort to get that stuff documented and articulated well. So, I could rant about this stuff for hours because it's, stuff I love, but it is stuff that our customers are thinking a lot about. And yeah, we're seeing some really good wins there as well.
You are already proving. So Mitch Voss, our director of sustainability, came out with his predictions for 2024 last week. And two of his biggest points were direct board involvement is taking a huge uptick. We are already, some reporting standards have always been asking about board involvement in these kinds of decisions. I know that the United Nations Global Compact wants to know specifically whether board compensation is tied to climate indicators, and that, I would love to see a lot more companies answering yes to that. And similarly, the actual assurance piece, and specifically when we look at scope 3, it's based on some data that can be a little bit softer. There's a lot more estimating involved, and assurance companies are going to be a lot more interested in understanding exactly how you got to the numbers that you publicly disclosed. It's really exciting to see, and I'm glad that you are recognizing the predictions on the ground. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I'll pretend I came up with that by myself, and I didn't just refer to Mitch's notes. But no, I agree. It's really exciting to see. I think as a data nerd and as someone who cares deeply about our climate, when those two worlds come together, and that quality thing happens in the middle, that's only good news, I think.
I completely agree. Joel, thank you so much for joining the Week on Sustainability. Again, looking forward to having you back.
Sustain.Life is the leading and most comprehensive sustainability software on the market. To learn how we can help your company measure its emissions and take climate action, go to Sustain.Life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.